The night smelled of rain and secrets that should have stayed buried. Vesper knew the manuscript pressed against her ribs was more than just paper. It was a death sentence. She had one mission: burn it and disappear before they found her. But when silver bullets shattered the gaslit silence, instinct overrode fear. She didn't run. In a heartbeat of madness, she threw herself into the line of fire to save the daughter of her worst enemy. Now Cyprian Valerius, the vampire king, offers her the only sanctuary left. But his protection demands a price higher than her life. To survive the hunters, she must do the unthinkable: surrender her freedom and become the monster's wife. The scent of rain-soaked cobblestones filled Vesper's lungs as she pushed through the narrow alley behind the antique shop. Her boots splashed through puddles that reflected the amber glow of gas lamps, each step echoing against brick walls that seemed to lean inward, conspiring. She clutched the leather satchel tighter against her ribs, feeling the sharp corners of the manuscript inside press through the worn fabric of her coat. The city had changed in the 3 months since her grandmother's death. Or perhaps Vesper had simply started seeing what had always been there, lurking in the spaces between streetlights. The whispers in the university library, the way certain students avoided the old chapel after dark, the missing persons reports that the police dismissed with practiced indifference. A cat yowled somewhere above, and Vesper's pulse quickened. She quickened her pace, her breath forming small clouds in the October air. The manuscript felt heavier with each step, as if the weight of its secrets had physical mass. Her grandmother's final words scratched at her memory like fingernails on glass. The Valerius bloodline remembers everything. Burn it before they find you. Too late for burning now. The alley opened onto a wider street, and Vesper allowed herself a moment to breathe. Victorian mansions lined the boulevard, their windows dark except for occasional flickers of candlelight. She'd taken this route 100 times, cutting through the historic district to reach her apartment near the river. Tonight, the familiar felt foreign. The shadows moved wrong. A figure stepped from a doorway 10 feet ahead. Vesper's hand moved instinctively to the iron pendant at her throat, her grandmother's last gift. The figure resolved into a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat that seemed to absorb the lamplight rather than reflect it. His face remained in shadow, but she could feel his attention like a physical weight pressing against her sternum. "Miss Cowell." His voice carried the cultured accent of old money and older secrets. "Walking alone at this hour. How remarkably foolish." She didn't ask how he knew her name. Instead, she catalogued exits the alley behind her, the side street 20 yards to her left, the iron fence surrounding the nearest mansion. Her fingers tightened on the satchel strap. "I have nothing worth stealing," she said, keeping her voice steady. "On the contrary." He moved forward, and the lamplight caught his face. Sharp cheekbones, pale skin that seemed to drink in the darkness, and eyes the color of aged wine. "You carry something that belongs to my family. Something your grandmother stole 50 years ago." The manuscript. Vesper's throat constricted. She took a step backward, her heel catching on uneven pavement. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Cyprian Valerius." He inclined his head in a gesture that belonged to a different century. "And you are a terrible liar, Miss Cale. Your pulse is racing. I can hear it from here." Before she could process the impossibility of that statement, before she could run or scream or do anything but stand frozen in the amber light, the world exploded into chaos. The crack of gunfire shattered the night. Not the sharp pop of modern weapons, but the deeper boom of something older, more deliberate. Cyprien moved with inhuman speed, his coat billowing as he lunged toward her. Vesper threw herself sideways, hitting the pavement hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. The satchel skidded across wet stone. Another shot. This one struck the lamppost above her head, and Vesper saw something that made her mind rebel. The bullet glowed with a pale, sickly light. Where it impacted the iron post, steam rose with a sound like meat hitting a hot pan. "Silver," Cyprian hissed. He crouched beside her, and in the chaos of the moment, Vesper saw his face transform. His mouth opened too wide. His teeth caught the lamplight, elongated canines gleaming like polished bone. "The hunters have found us both." How delightfully inconvenient. Vesper's training as a researcher, her years of academic skepticism, crumbled like ash. She'd read the manuscript. She'd dismissed it as folklore, Gothic fantasy, the ravings of a woman who'd lived through too much war and loss. But her grandmother hadn't been mad. She'd been warning her. Vampires were real, and she was lying on wet cobblestones while silver bullets designed to kill them tore through the night air around her. "Stay down," Cyprian commanded. His hand pressed against her shoulder, and even through her coat, his touch burned with impossible cold. He rose in a fluid motion, facing the direction of the gunfire. "Show yourselves, cowards. Or has the Order of the Crimson Dawn forgotten how to face their prey with honor?" 3 figures emerged from the shadows across the street. They wore tactical gear that looked wrong in the gaslit district, modern weapons incongruous against the Victorian backdrop. The leader, a man with a scarred face and eyes like flint, raised his rifle. "Valerius, the council has ordered your termination. Surrender, and we'll make it quick." Cyprian laughed, and the sound raised every hair on Vesper's arms. "Commander Rurik, still following orders from frightened old men. Tell me, does the council know you're operating in my territory, or is this another of your unauthorized hunts?" The tension stretched taut as wire. Vesper's fingers found the iron pendant, gripping it hard enough that the edges cut into her palm. She needed to move, to run, but her body refused to cooperate. Shock had her pinned as effectively as Cyprian's command. Then a new voice shattered the standoff. Young, female, desperate. "Father," a girl appeared at the corner of the nearest mansion, no more than 16, with Cyprian's sharp features softened by youth. She wore a white dress that seemed to glow in the darkness, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She ran toward them with the reckless speed of someone who didn't understand the danger. "Isolde, no." Cyprian's composure cracked. Real fear flooded his voice. "Get back inside." But the girl Isolde had already crossed half the distance, and Commander Rurik's rifle swung toward her with mechanical precision. Vesper moved without thinking. Her body unlocked, adrenaline overriding shock, and she launched herself forward. She collided with Isolde just as the rifle fired, bearing them both to the ground behind a stone planter. Silver bullets struck the planter's edge, sending chips of granite flying. One fragment sliced across Vesper's cheek, and she tasted copper. Isolde struggled beneath her, surprisingly strong. "Let me go. My father is trying to keep you alive." Vesper gasped. "Stay down." The night erupted into violence. Cyprian moved like smoke and shadow, crossing the distance to the hunters faster than Vesper's eyes could track. She heard screams, the wet sound of tearing, the clatter of weapons hitting stone. She kept her body over Isolde's, feeling the girl's rapid heartbeat against her own chest, and tried not to think about what was happening in the street behind them. Silence fell with shocking suddenness. Vesper risked a glance over the planter's edge. Cyprian stood alone in the middle of the street. Blood, impossibly dark in the lamplight, stained his coat and hands. The hunters were gone. Not dead, she realized with a mixture of relief and horror. Simply gone, as if they'd never been there at all. Cyprian turned toward them, and Vesper saw his face clearly for the first time. The inhuman mask had fallen away, leaving something more terrible, genuine emotion. Fear, gratitude, and beneath it all, a calculating intelligence that made her stomach clench. "You saved my daughter's life," he said quietly. He moved toward them with deliberate slowness, giving Vesper time to scramble to her feet and help Isolde up. "The hunters will return with reinforcements. They know about you now, Miss Cale. They know you carry the Valerius archives, and they know you've been marked by my touch." He gestured to her shoulder, where his hand had pressed. "You cannot go home. You cannot hide. They will hunt you as they hunt us." "Then I'll run," Vesper said. Her voice shook, but she met his wine-dark eyes. "I'll leave the city, burn the manuscript, disappear. They'll find you." Cyprian stepped closer, and Vesper caught the scent of old books and older blood. "The Order has resources across every continent, but I can offer you protection. Absolute, eternal protection." His lips pulled back, revealing those impossible teeth. "Marry me, Miss Cale. Become part of my bloodline. The hunters cannot touch the wife of the vampire king without declaring open war on every undead court in existence." His smile held no warmth, only dark promise. "All you have to do is surrender your mortality and your freedom. A small price for your life, wouldn't you say?" The manuscript pressed against Vesper's side where she'd grabbed the fallen satchel. Her grandmother's warnings echoed in her skull. The cut on her cheek throbbed with each heartbeat. Cyprian extended his hand, pale and perfect in the lamplight. "Choose quickly," he whispered. "I can hear them coming back." The lamplight flickered against Cyprian's outstretched hand, casting skeletal shadows across his pale fingers. Vesper's breath caught in her throat, her pulse hammering so hard she could feel it in her temples, behind her eyes, in the cut on her cheek that still wept blood. The manuscript's weight pressed against her hip through the leather satchel, a reminder of everything her grandmother had warned her about. Never trust the beautiful ones, never accept their gifts. But her grandmother had never stood in a ruined library with death closing in from all sides. Vesper's voice cracked. She swallowed, tasting copper and dust. "I need time to—" The window exploded inward. Glass rained down in a crystalline cascade as three figures burst through the shattered frame, crossbows raised. Vesper barely had time to register the silver-tipped bolts before Cyprian moved. He didn't run, he simply ceased to be in one place and manifested in another, a blur of shadow and velocity that her eyes couldn't track. His hand closed around her wrist with crushing force, yanking her backward just as a bolt embedded itself in the floorboard where she'd been standing. "Isolde to me." Cyprian's voice cut through the chaos with absolute authority. The girl was already moving, her small form darting between the bookcases with inhuman speed. Silas appeared from nowhere, his elderly frame suddenly possessed of terrible strength as he caught one hunter by the throat and hurled him into the wall hard enough to crack plaster. The man crumpled, unconscious or dead. Vesper's feet barely touched the ground as Cyprian dragged her toward the back of the library. Her shoulder screamed in protest, the joint wrenching in its socket. She clutched the satchel to her chest with her free hand, stumbling over fallen books and broken glass. Behind them, crossbows thrummed. Something whistled past her ear so close she felt the displacement of air against her skin. The passage, Isolde's voice, high and frightened, came from somewhere ahead. "Father," the passage. They plunged through a doorway Vesper hadn't noticed before, concealed behind a false bookcase that Silas must have triggered. The narrow corridor beyond smelled of earth and centuries-old stone. Cyprian released her wrist only to wrap his arm around her waist, lifting her bodily as he increased his speed. The world became a rushing darkness punctuated by the sound of boots thundering behind them, and Isolde's rapid breathing somewhere close. They descended. Stone stairs worn smooth by countless feet spiraled down into blackness. Vesper's stomach lurched with each impossibly fast step. She squeezed her eyes shut against the vertigo, pressing her face against Cyprian's shoulder. He smelled like old parchment and something darker, something that made her think of crypts and roses left too long in stagnant water. The stairs ended abruptly. Cyprian set her down with surprising gentleness, steadying her when her legs threatened to buckle. They stood in what appeared to be a wine cellar, though the bottles lining the walls were covered in dust so thick it looked like grey velvet. A single oil lamp hung from an iron hook, casting weak amber light across the vaulted ceiling. "Silas," Isolde's voice trembled. She stood pressed against the far wall, her dark eyes enormous in her pale face. "He'll hold them as long as he can." Cyprian moved to a section of wall that looked identical to all the others, running his fingers along the mortar between stones. "Then he'll follow." "But the silver," Isolde's voice broke. "He knows the risks." Something in the wall clicked. A section of stone swung inward, revealing another passage, this one so narrow they'd have to move single file. "Go. Now." Isolde slipped through without hesitation. Vesper's hands shook as she adjusted the satchel's strap, her mind still trying to catch up with her body. 5 minutes ago she'd been making an impossible choice. Now she was fleeing through secret passages beneath a vampire's library, while men with crossbows hunted her like an animal. "Miss Cale." Cyprian's voice was soft but unyielding. "We don't have time for shock." She forced herself to move, squeezing through the opening. The passage beyond was barely wide enough for her shoulders. Rough stone scraped against her arms through her coat sleeves. She could hear Isolde ahead, the girl's breathing quick and shallow in the darkness. Behind her, Cyprian's presence filled the narrow space like a physical pressure. They walked for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Vesper's legs burned. Her lungs ached. The cut on her cheek had stopped bleeding, but had begun to throb with a deep, nauseating pulse. She focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on the sound of Isolde's footsteps, on anything except the crushing weight of stone above her head, and the knowledge that she'd just thrown her entire life away. The passage opened without warning into a vast underground chamber. Vesper stumbled out, gasping, and stopped dead. They stood in what could only be described as a cathedral. Vaulted ceilings soared overhead, supported by columns carved with intricate patterns that seemed to writhe in the light of hundreds of candles. The floor was polished black marble, reflecting the flames until it looked like they stood on a sea of fire. At the far end of the chamber, a massive throne sat on a raised dais, carved from a single piece of obsidian. But it was the people that made Vesper's breath catch. Dozens of them filled the space, all impossibly beautiful, all turning to stare at the newcomers with eyes that reflected the candlelight like cat's eyes. Women in gowns that belonged in museums. Men in suits cut from fabrics Vesper couldn't name. A child, or something that looked like a child, sat on the edge of a fountain, dangling bare feet in water that ran red as wine. "Father," Isolde's voice was small. "You brought her to court. I had no choice." Cyprian moved past them, his boots clicking against the marble with sharp authority. The assembled vampires parted before him like water. The hunters breached the library. They know about the Valerius archives. They know about Miss Cale. A woman stepped forward from the crowd. She wore a dress of deep burgundy velvet, that pooled around her feet like blood, and her hair fell in a silver cascade to her waist. Her face was ageless, beautiful in a way that made Vesper's eyes ache. "You brought a human to sanctuary." The woman's voice carried the weight of centuries. "A mortal who carries our secrets, who has been marked but not turned." Her gaze fixed on Vesper with predatory intensity. How unprecedented. "Lady Morgaine," Cyprian inclined his head, a gesture that somehow managed to convey respect without submission. "I invoke the right of protection for this woman. She is under my personal guard." A ripple of whispers moved through the assembled court. Vesper felt their eyes on her like physical touches, assessing, calculating. She wanted to shrink back, to run, but there was nowhere to go. Isolde had moved to stand beside her, the girl's small hand finding hers and squeezing tight. The right of protection. Morgaine's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. How gallant. And what, pray tell, does she offer in return? What makes this particular mortal worth protecting? Cyprian's jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing. "Then she has agreed to become my wife." The silence that fell was absolute. Vesper's mouth went dry. She opened it to protest, to correct him, to explain that she'd agreed to nothing. But Isolde's hand squeezed hers again, harder this time, and the girl's voice whispered directly into her ear. "Don't, please, just don't. Your wife." Morgaine's eyebrows rose. "How romantic. And does the mortal understand what that means? What she would become?" Vesper's voice came out as a croak. She cleared her throat, forced steel into her spine. "I understand that the hunters will kill me if I refuse. I understand that I don't have a choice." "Oh, my dear." Morgaine glided closer, her movements too smooth, too fluid. She reached out and traced one cold finger down Vesper's injured cheek, following the line of the cut. Vesper flinched but held her ground. "We always have choices. The question is whether we have the courage to make them." She brought her finger to her lips, tasting Vesper's blood. Her eyes closed in something like ecstasy. "Interesting. Very interesting. There's something in her blood, Cyprian. Something old. Something that remembers." Cyprian moved then, faster than thought, putting himself between Morgaine and Vesper. "She is under my protection," he repeated, and this time his voice carried an edge that made the candles flicker. "Mine. Do not presume to taste what belongs to the Valerius line." Morgaine laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Possessive already. How delightful." She stepped back, spreading her hands in mock surrender. "Very well, the court recognizes your claim, but you know the law, Cyprian. If she is to be your bride, she must prove herself worthy. She must face the trial of blood." More whispers, these edged with anticipation. Vesper felt Isolde's hand tighten to the point of pain. "The trial hasn't been invoked in 2 centuries, Cyprian said flatly. "Then we're overdue." Morgaine's smile was all teeth. 3 nights from now, she survives. She earns her place among us. She fails. The smile widened. "Well, at least she'll die knowing she tried." The room they gave Vesper was beautiful in the way that crypts are beautiful, all cold marble and velvet curtains, the color of dried blood. A 4-poster bed dominated the space, its canopy hung with fabric so old it was nearly transparent. Candles burned in wall sconces, their flames perfectly still in the absence of any breeze. Isolde hadn't left her side since Morgaine's pronouncement. The girl sat curled in a chair by the fireplace, which held no fire, only more candles, watching Vesper pace with worried eyes. "The trial of blood," Vesper said for the 3rd time. "What is it?" I don't know. Isolde's voice was barely audible. Father won't tell me. He says I'm too young to remember the last one. Vesper pressed her palms against her temples, trying to think through the exhaustion and terror. Your father told them I agreed to marry him. I didn't. I hadn't decided. I know. Isolde pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself small. But if he hadn't claimed you, if he hadn't invoked the right of protection, Lady Morgaine would have killed you where you stood, or worse than death. The girl's expression was ancient in her young face. There are many things worse than death, Miss Cale. My father knows them all. A knock at the door made them both jump. Isolde was on her feet in an instant, positioning herself between Vesper and the door. Who is it? Silas, the butler's voice, muffled by wood and stone. I've brought food and clothing for Miss Cale. Isolde opened the door a crack, then wider when she confirmed it was indeed Silas. The old man entered carrying a silver tray laden with bread, cheese, and a decanter of dark wine. His coat was torn, and Vesper caught sight of what looked like burns on his hands before he set the tray down and tucked them behind his back. You're hurt, Vesper said. Silver burned slowly. Silas's smile was gentle. But I've survived worse. You should eat, Miss Cale. You'll need your strength. Vesper's stomach turned at the thought of food, but she forced herself to take a piece of bread. It tasted like ash in her mouth. What is the trial of blood? Silas and Isolde exchanged a look. I deserve to know, Vesper pressed. If I'm going to die in 3 days, I at least deserve to know how. You won't die. Isolde's voice was fierce. Father won't let you die. Your father may not have a choice. He always has a choice. The girl's hands clenched into fists. He's the Vampire King. He could. She stopped abruptly, her eyes going wide. Could what? Vesper set down the bread. Isolde, what aren't you telling me? The door opened again without warning. Cyprian stood in the threshold, still wearing his blood-spattered coat. His eyes found Vesper immediately, scanning her as if checking for injuries. Then he looked at Isolde. Leave us. But father, now, Isolde. The girl's face crumpled, but she obeyed, slipping past her father with her head down. Silas followed, closing the door softly behind them. Cyprian moved to the window, though it showed nothing but more stone, a false window painted with a view of moonlight and gardens. He stood with his back to Vesper, his shoulders rigid. You lied to them, Vesper said. I never agreed to marry you. I know. Then why? Because it was the only way to keep you alive long enough to make a real choice. He turned, and Vesper was struck again by how tired he looked. How old, despite his unlined face. The court would have torn you apart to get to the archives. Morgaine especially. She's been hunting for the Valerius records for 300 years. Why? Because they contain the truth about what we are, where we came from, how we can be destroyed. His smile was bitter. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, Miss Cale. She spent her life documenting our weaknesses. Every vampire in this court would kill to ensure that knowledge dies with you. Vesper's hand moved instinctively to the satchel which she'd set on the bed. Then why protect me? Why not just take the manuscript and let them have me? Because. Cyprian moved closer, his footsteps silent on the stone floor. Because Isolde likes you. Because you tried to protect her when the hunters came. Because. He stopped an arm's length away, close enough that Vesper could see the flecks of darker red in his wine-colored eyes. Because. I'm tired, Miss Cale. So very tired. And you remind me of what it was like to be human. To be afraid. To have choices that matter. The trial, Vesper whispered. What is it? A hunt. His voice was flat. You'll be released into the catacombs beneath the court, given a head start. Then they'll come for you, the younger vampires, the ones still hungry. If you survive until dawn, you pass. If you don't. He didn't finish. Vesper's legs gave out. She sat heavily on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking. I can't outrun vampires. I can't. You won't be alone. Cyprian knelt before her, bringing himself to her eye level. I'll be with you. I can't fight them. That would violate the trial's rules. But I can guide you. I can keep you alive. Why? The word came out as a sob. Why would you do that? His hand rose, hesitated, then gently touched her uninjured cheek. His fingers were cold but careful, because Isolde needs someone who isn't a monster, because the court needs to remember that humans are more than food, because his thumb brushed away a tear Vesper hadn't realized she'd shed, because I haven't felt anything in 200 years, and when I look at you, I remember what it was like to feel. Before Vesper could respond, before she could process the impossible tenderness in his touch, a scream shattered the silence. Isolde's scream. Cyprian was gone before Vesper could blink, the door slamming open with enough force to crack the frame. She grabbed the satchel and ran after him, her heart in her throat. The corridor outside was chaos. Vampires rushed past in blurs of motion, all heading toward the same place. Vesper followed the current, her human pace agonizingly slow. She burst into the main chamber to find Cyprian holding Isolde, the girl sobbing against his chest. And on the floor, in a spreading pool of blood, lay Silas. A silver bolt protruded from his back, right between the shoulder blades. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. The hunters, Morgaine's voice cut through the shocked silence. They've found the sanctuary. Someone told them how to breach our wards. Cyprian's head snapped up, his eyes blazing. Impossible. No one outside the inner court knows the passage. And yet here we are. Morgaine gestured to the body. Someone betrayed us, Cyprian. Someone in this room is a traitor. Her gaze swept across the assembled vampires, then landed on Vesper with terrible finality. Someone who arrived just hours ago. Someone who carries the hunter's archives. Someone who would have every reason to lead them straight to us. The court's eyes turned as one, fixing on Vesper with predatory hunger, and in the sudden terrible silence, Vesper heard it, the distant sound of boots on stone growing closer. The hunters were coming. The accusation hung in the air like poison. Vesper's lungs seized, the weight of every vampire's stare pressing against her ribs. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but Cyprian's voice cut through first, cold, absolute, terrifying in its certainty. Touch her, and I will end you myself. The words weren't spoken to Morgaine. They were spoken to everyone. To the entire court that had begun to shift, to circle predators scenting blood. Cyprian still held Isolde, but his free hand had moved to rest on the hilt of his blade. Vesper came to us seeking sanctuary. She brought us intelligence we desperately needed. She has earned my protection. Protection? Morgaine's laugh was brittle. Or has she earned something else? Your judgment is compromised, my king. We all see how you look at her. The boots were louder now, closer. Vesper could hear the rhythmic march, the clank of weapons. Her hand found the satchel at her side, fingers closing around the strap. Inside were the archives, yes, but also something else. Something she'd taken from her father's study the night she'd fled. I didn't betray you. Vesper's voice came out steadier than she felt. But I know who did. Every eye fixed on her again, but this time with different hunger. Curiosity. Suspicion. Hope. She pulled out a folded letter, its edges worn from her reading it over and over during sleepless nights. My father kept correspondence with someone inside your court. Someone who's been feeding the hunters information for months. Someone who wanted Cyprian dead so they could take his place. Vesper's gaze moved to the tall, silver-haired vampire standing just behind Morgaine. Lord Theren, who'd been silent through the entire accusation, who'd arrived at the sanctuary only yesterday, claiming he'd barely escaped a hunter ambush. Someone who knew exactly when and where to lead the hunters to make it look like I was responsible. Theren's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Something ancient and cruel. Bold words from a human who reeks of fear. His voice was silk over steel. "Show us this letter then. Let us see this supposed proof." Vesper held it out. Cyprian released Isolde gently, moving to take the paper. His fingers brushed Vesper's cold, steady, and she felt the tremor that ran through him as he read. "Theren." Cyprian's voice had gone quiet, deadly. "You swore a blood oath to me 3 centuries ago, and I kept it." Theren's mask finally cracked, revealing the rage beneath. "Until you became weak. Until you started believing we could coexist with them, with humans, with the very cattle that hunt us." The boots were at the door now. Vesper heard Commander Rurik's voice barking orders, heard the scrape of silver weapons being drawn. "I gave the hunters everything they needed," Theren continued, his words coming faster now, more desperate. "Because someone had to save us from your mercy. Someone had to." He never finished. Cyprian moved like lightning, his blade clearing its sheath and driving through Theren's chest in one fluid motion. The traitor's eyes went wide, blood bubbling at his lips. "You gave them nothing they didn't already have," Cyprian said softly, twisting the blade, "except your soul." Theren crumbled to ash, his body disintegrating so quickly that Cyprian's sword passed through empty air. The door exploded inward. Hunters poured through the breach, silver crossbows raised, blessed blades gleaming. Commander Rurik led them, his weathered face set in grim determination. His eyes found Vesper immediately, and something like pain crossed his features. "Vesper care," his voice carried across the chaos. "Step away from them. Come home." Home. The word echoed in her chest, in the hollow place where her old life used to be. She thought of her father's study, of the smell of old books and pipe smoke, of Sunday dinners, and the weight of expectation, of the cage she'd been raised in, gilded with duty and lined with lies. She thought of Isolde's laugh, of Silas's patient teaching, of Cyprian's hands in her hair, his mouth on her throat, the terrible, beautiful truth of him. Vesper stepped forward, placing herself between the hunters and the vampires. "I am home." Rurik's face hardened. "So be it." The battle erupted like a storm breaking. Vampires blurred into motion, meeting the hunters' charge within human speed. Silver bolts sang through the air. Vesper ducked as one whistled past her ear, so close she felt the blessed metal's heat. A vampire to her left took a bolt to the shoulder and screamed, the silver burning through supernatural flesh like acid. Cyprian was everywhere at once, his blade a silver arc in the dim light. He moved with lethal grace, disarming one hunter, disabling another, always positioning himself between the attackers and Isolde. But there were too many. For every hunter that fell, 2 more pressed forward. Vesper saw Morgaine take a bolt to the thigh, saw her stumble, saw the hunter raise his blade for the killing blow. She didn't think. She grabbed the silver dagger from the fallen hunter beside her, the metal searing her palm, making her gasp, and threw it with all her strength. It caught the hunter in the shoulder, spinning him around. Morgaine's hand shot out, catching him by the throat and ending him in one brutal motion. Their eyes met across the chaos. Morgaine nodded once, then threw herself back into the fray. Vesper, Isolde's scream cut through the din. Vesper whirled to see Commander Rurik advancing on Cyprien from behind, a silver stake raised. Cyprien was engaged with 3 hunters, his attention divided, his back exposed. Vesper's body moved before her mind caught up. She launched herself at Rurik, tackling him with the full force of her human weight. They went down hard, the stake skittering across the blood-slicked floor. Rurik recovered first, his hand closing around her throat. "You don't know what you've done," he hissed, his grip tightening. "What you've become." Black spots danced across Vesper's vision. She clawed at his hands, her lungs screaming. Through the darkness closing in, she saw Cyprien turn, saw his face transform into something ancient and terrible. Rurik was torn away from her so violently that she heard bones crack. Cyprien held the commander suspended in the air, his hand around the man's throat, his eyes blazing crimson. "She has become," Cyprien said, his voice resonating with power that made the very stones tremble, exactly what she was always meant to be. He released Rurik, letting him crumple to the floor, alive but broken. The remaining hunters saw their commander fall and hesitated. That moment of doubt was all the court needed. The tide turned, the hunters retreating, dragging their wounded toward the shattered door. Rurik met Vesper's eyes one last time before his men carried him away. The look in them wasn't hatred, it was grief. Then they were gone, and the sanctuary fell silent, except for the ragged breathing of the survivors. Vesper's legs gave out. She sank to the floor, her burned palm throbbing, her throat bruised, her entire body shaking with adrenaline. Cyprien was there instantly, kneeling beside her, his cool hands gentle on her face. "You're hurt." His voice was raw, almost broken. "I'm alive." She managed to smile. "We're alive. You saved me." His thumb traced her cheekbone, his touch reverent. "You chose us." "I chose you," she corrected softly. "All of you." Isolde appeared at Cyprien's shoulder, her young face streaked with tears and blood. Will she be okay?" "She will be." Cyprien's arms slid around Vesper, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. "She will be." He carried her through the sanctuary, past the exhausted vampires tending their wounds, past Morgaine, who watched with something like respect in her ancient eyes. He carried her to his chambers and laid her on the bed with infinite care. "The wedding," Vesper said suddenly, remembering, "we were supposed to." "Can wait." Cyprien's fingers worked at the buttons of her blood-stained shirt, checking for injuries with methodical precision. "Everything can wait." But Vesper caught his hands, stilling them. "No, I want to do it now. Tonight, before anything else can go wrong." He stared at her, something vulnerable flickering across his perfect features. "You're certain? After everything, after what you've seen?" "I'm certain." She sat up, ignoring her protesting muscles. "I'm not afraid anymore, Cyprien. Not of you. Not of this life. Not of forever." The ceremony was small, intimate, held in the sanctuary's chapel as dawn approached outside. Isolde stood as witness, her hand clasped in Vesper's. Morgaine officiated, her voice carrying the weight of centuries as she spoke the old words, the binding words. When Cyprien lifted Vesper's wrist to his mouth, his eyes asked the question one final time. She nodded, her heart steady, her choice made. His fangs pierced her skin with exquisite precision. The pain was sharp, bright, but it faded quickly into something else, warmth spreading through her veins, a connection forming between them that went deeper than blood, deeper than flesh. She felt his essence flowing into her, felt the bond snap into place like a lock, finding its key. When he pulled away, his lips stained crimson. He looked younger somehow, more alive, more human. "My wife," he whispered, the words a prayer and a promise. "My husband," she answered, and kissed him as the first rays of sunlight touched the stained glass windows, painting them both in colors that looked like hope.